In the ranking of the aviation powers of the world, Spain is far from the first place, and the layman often will not even remember what is produced there at all. And this is a big underestimation. The Spanish aviation industry is more than a century old, and during this time it has become an important part of the European industry, leading for example in the field of military transport aviation. And in many ways they owe this success to a pair of small but important aircraft. Today we are getting acquainted with a father and a son, the CN-235 and C-295. Construcciones Aeronáuticas SA, or CASA, was born back in the 1920s and throughout the 20th century produced a lot of different equipment, both its own and licensed. The 1970s became a time for the company to look for new projects, which resulted in the idea of creating a new aircraft. Maybe a regional airliner, or maybe a military transport. CASA could not create this aircraft on its own, there were not enough resources. It was decided to find a strategic partner, and the aviators turned to long-term partners from Indonesia. Industri Pesawat Terbang Nusantara, or IPTN, had already licensed the production of the C-212 Aviacar, and also wanting to create a new aircraft supported the idea of expanding the partnership. The Spaniards received resources, cheap labor, and a potential market, while the Indonesians received aviation production and technology. The result of the negotiation was the creation in 1979 of Airtech International, the joint venture between CASA and IPTN, which immediately took up the creation of a new transport. In the early 1980s, the general appearance of the aircraft was formed. The resulting project was presented in the official announcement of Airtech at the Paris Air Show in 1981. So, the brainchild of Airtech is a light military transport aircraft, 21.4 meters long, 25.8 meters wingspan, and 8.2 meters high, close to vehicles such as the ATR-42. Quite miniature for a military transport. Its maximum takeoff weight is around 16.1 tons. For example, the C-130H Hercules, not the most gigantic aircraft, weighs more than 70 tons. In general appearance, nothing revolutionary. A straight high wing, a pair of turboprop engines, a ramp in the tail, and a single fin empennage. The landing gear of the aircraft is tricycle and reinforced, allowing it to work on unpaved runways. The front swivel leg is single-wheeled. The main gear received two wheels, one behind the other. They are located inside the fairing in the lower part of the fuselage, and in such a way that in the retracted state, the wheels still protrude a little, for safety in case of an emergency landing. The tail section of the fuselage is raised and equipped with a ramp that gives access to the cargo compartment and can be opened in flight. The cabin itself measures 1.9 by 2.7 meters in cross-section and approximately 9.6 meters in length. This is enough to accommodate 51 soldiers, 35 paratroopers or cargo, weighing up to 6 tons. The power plant is two General Electric CT7 turboprop engines. The CT7 is actually not very popular in the world of turboprop engines. Beside the CN-235, among serial machines it can be seen on the Swedish Saab 340. But in the world of turboshaft engines it is everywhere, both on civilian helicopters and in the T-700 version on military ones. On the CN-235, it delivers up to 1,750 horsepower on takeoff. A pair of these, coupled with 4-blade propellers, is quite enough for normal operation. Flight speed 248 knots, 450 km per hour. Flight altitude 7.6 km, ferry range 4,355 km. With such performance, the creators put into the machine the possibility of both civilian use as a regional airliner and military transport, universal and easily modified for a wide range of tasks. The aircraft, which received the index CN-235, was created quite quickly. Airtech approached the rollout ceremony creatively, taking into account all the diplomatic nuances. At the facilities of CASA in Getafe near Madrid and IPTN in Bandung near Jakarta, two prototypes were assembled in parallel. They were rolled out simultaneously in the presence of King Juan Carlos I in Spain and President Suharto in Indonesia. On November 11, 1983, the CASA prototype made its maiden flight, and a month later, the IPTN aircraft took to the skies. Flight tests were quite active, although not without difficulties and delays. The main test program ended in 1986, when the CN-235 received type certificates, first from the aviation authorities of Spain and Indonesia, and then from the American FAA. The first production vehicles went to customers in 1987, and a year later they entered service. The Spaniards and Indonesians could be happy with themselves. The aircraft were quite modern and competitive, and at a cost of only about $6 million. Among the military planes, it successfully settled in a niche between light transports, being much more spacious than them, and medium ones, which were more expensive. And among civilians, it surpassed colleagues in spaciousness, although it was a little heavier and inferior in a number of qualities. As a result, by 1989, at the height of mass production, Airtech had a backlog of orders for 133 aircraft, 74 military and 59 civilian. Adaptability and modifiability also did their job. On the basis of the CN-235, almost immediately they began to create various versions: sea patrols, anti-submarine aircraft, VIP transports, and so on. Meanwhile, IPTN and CASA often work separately here, making modifications on their own. Despite the fact that initially a larger manufacturing volume was supposed to be in Indonesia, over time production shifted more and more to Spain, as a result of which it turned out that about 80% of serial aircraft were from Iberian Peninsula. In total, by 2023, about 354 aircraft were assembled, which is not bad. The CN-235 did not become a bestseller, but ended up being popular in dozens of countries around the world, both developing and developed, including those which have their own powerful aviation industry. The largest operator of the CN-235 is Turkey, flying 59 aircraft. The plan for mass production of passenger versions of the CN-235 can be considered only partially implemented. On the one hand, it was still inferior to purely commercial relatives, because military transport functions were a burden here. But on the other hand, there were still deliveries, which cannot be said about most other military transports, the civilian versions of which are often not needed by anyone. In the late 1990s, there were changes in the joint business. IPTN was reorganized and became the modern Indonesian airspace, and CASA became part of EADS, the current Airbus group. Pretending that nothing had changed did not work out, and the project in fact began to slowly develop separately in Spain and Indonesia. In Indonesia, they decided to place more emphasis on the civilian sector and took up the N-250, a turboprop passenger aircraft created on the basis of the CN-235. The project is developing with difficulty. In the late 1990s, it was actually stopped by the Asian financial crisis, and the N-250 was remembered only in the 2010s. Now Indonesian Airspace is working on two versions, a 50-seat N-245 and a 70-seat N-270. We'll see what comes out of it in the next few years. For the Spaniards, the prevalence of military orders over civilian ones led to the obvious conclusion: to make a purely military aircraft. Work on the upgraded plane, named C-295, began in 1996 and was carried out entirely by CASA. Despite the fact that the CN-235 was used as a base, the number of changes in the new aircraft is impressive. The main external change was the fuselage, which became longer by 3 meters. The plane became larger and considerably heavier. The maximum takeoff weight of the C-295 is 21 tons, with the possibility of overloading by another 2, while the 235th weighed 16 tons. The cargo compartment has grown and can now carry up to 9.2 tons, more than the old plane by a half, which is 70 soldiers, 48 paratroopers, or, as stated, 3 Land Rovers. Apparently very relevant information. Because of such an increase in mass, naturally the landing gear was changed, the main gear of which was reinforced, and the front leg became two-wheeled. The power plant was also replaced. The 1,750 horsepower General Electric CT7 with 4 blades gave way to the 2,644 horsepower Pratt & Whitney PW127G with 6 blades. The flight speed is now 260 knots. The maximum range is 4,587. Not that much improvement. Most of the additional power goes to compensate for the increased mass of the aircraft. The filling was also for the most part replaced with modern equipment. Thales top deck know their stuff. And in 2019, it was even announced that the cockpit will receive the Collins ProLine Fusion avionics system. The dashboard from a business jet will make the service of at least the pilots more comfortable. By focusing on the military work of the C-295, CASA has made it even more flexible here. There are so many versions of it: cargo, medical and passenger transports, maritime patrols, anti-submarine aircraft, electronic intelligence aircraft, AWACS, tankers, even bombers and gunships. Not as scary as the AC-130 Spectre, but still. Plus, in the early 2010s, Airbus military began to modernize the aircraft, resulting in the whole flock becoming even more diverse. Planes began receiving new onboard systems and improvements to individual elements. For example, the wing of the C-295W version acquired hefty winglets. Unlike the Indonesian relatives, the brainchild of the Spaniards was developing quite dynamically. In November 1997, the C-295 prototype made its maiden flight, and at the end of 1999 it was certified. Another 2 years later, after solving problems and delays in production, it began to be delivered to customers, the first of which was the native Spanish Air Force, and then the air forces of several other near and far countries. Distant relatives did not forget about the aircraft either. Indonesian Airspace also set up licensed production of the C-295 for local operators. The third place where licensed production of the C-295 can begin is India, which ordered a batch of 56 aircraft at once with an option for another 15, some of which should be produced on its territory at the facilities of Tata Advanced Systems. Localization of production at home is India's basic strategy now. Despite the fact that when creating the C-295, CASA concentrated on its military role, it is also certified as a civilian aircraft and stubbornly climbs into this market, albeit on a small scale, at least for now. The aircraft also participates in Airbus research programs, becoming a flying lab for developing advanced technologies. In total, at the beginning of 2020, about 200 units fly in 24 countries around the world. The C-295, like the CN-235, cannot be called some incredible breakthroughs in the history of aviation. They are not fast, not huge, and did not take part in any epic missions. They are simple, light, and efficient transports and multifunctional aircraft, which are always somewhere in the rear, serve quietly and almost invisibly. But if it were not for them, most likely the leaders, the very ones we see in the foreground, would feel much worse. And the children are just like their parents. CASA is not Dassault or Lockheed Martin, but being part of the European aviation industry, it does a lot to make Airbus the world leader we know it to be. That's all for today. We wish easy flights to the light transport and good luck to its creators. Like and subscribe to the channel, aviation lovers. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Fast flights on airplanes from different countries, and soft landings to you.